The sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Montana Territory as Preston Wells spotted a familiar silhouette on the horizon, his heart nearly stopping at the sight. It had been 7 years since he'd seen Josephine Taylor. 7 long years of carrying nothing but her memory and a faded tintype photograph in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Preston pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around the animal's legs as he stared at the approaching stagecoach. The year was 1876, and the small settlement of Riverspend had grown considerably since he'd left to make his fortune in the gold fields of California. But nothing had changed as much as the woman he'd left behind. "Whoa there," he murmured to his horse, patting its neck absently. His eyes never left the stagecoach as it rumbled toward town. He hadn't known she was returning today. Truth be told, he hadn't known she was returning at all. His hand unconsciously moved to his chest, feeling the outline of the photograph through his shirt. Josephine Taylor, his childhood friend, his first love, the woman he'd promised to return for but never did. The shame of that broken promise had kept him from writing to her for years, and by the time he'd gathered his courage, he'd learned she had moved east to live with her aunt in Boston. The stagecoach rolled into town, wheels kicking up clouds of dust that obscured his view. Preston urged his horse forward, trying to appear casual despite the thundering of his heart. He dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post with trembling hands. The stagecoach door swung open, and the driver helped a woman down. Preston's breath caught in his throat. Josephine stood there in a fine blue traveling dress, her chestnut hair pinned neatly beneath a fashionable hat. She looked different, more refined, more mature, but her eyes were the same deep brown he remembered, like rich coffee on cold mornings. She hadn't seen him yet. Preston removed his hat, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. His clothes were dusty from the ride into town, his face unshaven. He wasn't the polished young man who had promised to return a wealthy hero. "Miss Taylor," the stagecoach driver called, handing down her traveling case. "Welcome back to Riverspend." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice carrying on the breeze. Preston froze at the sound. 7 years melted away in an instant. As if sensing his gaze, Josephine turned. Their eyes met across the crowded street, and for a moment the world around them ceased to exist. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by something Preston couldn't quite read: surprise, certainly, but whether it was pleasure or pain, he couldn't tell. "Josie," he whispered, though she was too far to hear. She stood perfectly still, her traveling case clutched in gloved hands. Then, with deliberate movements, she turned away, speaking to the stagecoach driver once more before walking toward the hotel. The dismissal stung worse than any physical blow Preston had ever received. He deserved it, he knew. He'd made promises he hadn't kept. He'd written letters that became increasingly infrequent until they stopped altogether. He'd abandoned her. But seeing her again here now awakened something he'd tried desperately to bury beneath years of hard work and harder living. Josephine Taylor was still the only woman who had ever claimed his heart. Preston jammed his hat back on his head and strode toward the saloon. He needed a drink to steady his nerves before deciding what to do next. Because one thing was certain now that Josephine was back in Riverspend, he wasn't about to let her slip away again without at least trying to make things right. The interior of the Silver Dollar Saloon was dim and smoky, a welcome respite from the bright Montana sunshine. Preston made his way to the bar, nodding to familiar faces but avoiding conversation. His mind was too full of Josephine to engage in the usual pleasantries. "Whiskey?" he said to the barkeep, placing a coin on the scarred wooden surface. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Wells," said a voice to his right. Preston turned to find Sheriff Daniel Mackenzie watching him with knowing eyes. The older man had been sheriff of Riverspend for nearly 15 years and had known both Preston and Josephine since they were children. "Something like that," Preston admitted. Accepting the glass of amber liquid the barkeep slid his way. "I take it you've seen Miss Taylor then," Sheriff Mackenzie said, sipping his own drink. Preston's eyes narrowed. "You knew she was coming back. Got a letter from her about a week ago. She's returned to settle her father's estate now that the probate period is over." The news hit Preston like a physical blow. Her father died when Sheriff Mackenzie gave him a hard look. 6 months ago, pneumonia took him quick. You didn't know? Preston shook his head, shame washing over him anew. He'd been so caught up in his own affairs, building his cattle ranch just outside of town, that he'd lost touch with everyone from his past. Old man Taylor had been kind to him, treating him like a son even when Preston was just a ranch hand with nothing to his name. "I should have been here," he muttered, downing his whiskey in one burning swallow. "Yes, you should have," the sheriff agreed without malice. "But you're here now. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Preston signaled for another drink, buying time to consider the question. What could he do? Josephine had clearly moved on. The sophisticated woman he'd glimpsed stepping down from the stagecoach bore little resemblance to the girl he'd left behind. And the way she'd looked at him with such cold recognition suggested that whatever feelings she might have harbored for him had long since died. "I don't know," he admitted finally. Sheriff Mackenzie pushed away from the bar. "Well, figure it out soon. Word is, she's only staying long enough to sell the ranch and then heading back east. Seems she's engaged to some Boston banker." The sheriff's words hit Preston like a physical blow. Engaged. The possibility shouldn't have surprised him, yet it did. In all his imaginings of Josephine over the years, he had never pictured her with another man. "When's the wedding?" he asked, his voice rough. "Don't know. Soon, I expect. Her fiancé is supposed to join her here in a few weeks to help finalize everything before they return east together." Preston nodded, staring into his second glass of whiskey without really seeing it. "Thanks for telling me." Sheriff Mackenzie clapped him on the shoulder. "You were always a good man, Preston, just sometimes a foolish one." With that, he left the saloon, leaving Preston alone with his thoughts. Engaged to a Boston banker. The words repeated in Preston's mind like a cruel joke. He'd spent years building his ranch, creating something he could be proud of, something worthy of the woman he'd never forgotten. And all the while, she'd been building a new life without him. Preston finished his drink and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight. Across the street, he could see Josephine emerging from the hotel, now dressed in a simpler day dress. She paused on the boardwalk, consulting a piece of paper in her hand, before turning and walking purposefully toward the lawyer's office. Before he could think better of it, Preston crossed the street. If nothing else, he owed her an explanation and perhaps an apology for his silence all these years. "Josephine," he called, his voice carrying in the quiet street. She stopped, her back stiffening slightly before she turned to face him. Up close, he could see the changes in her more clearly. She was still beautiful, more so, even than in his memories, but there was a guarded quality to her expression that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Wells," she said formally, her voice cool and controlled. "I heard you had returned to Riversbend permanently. Congratulations on your ranch." "I understand it's quite successful." Preston removed his hat, suddenly feeling every bit the rough cowboy he was in comparison to her ladylike composure. "Thank you," he said. "I'm sorry about your father. I only just heard. He was a good man." A flicker of genuine grief passed across her face. "Yes, he was. Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with 7 years of unspoken words. "Josie, I prefer Josephine now," she interrupted, her tone softening slightly at the look on his face. "And I'm afraid I'm late for an appointment with Mr. Garrison about my father's will, if you'll excuse me." Preston stepped aside, feeling as though he'd been dismissed for the second time that day. "Of course, I didn't mean to keep you." She nodded and started to move past him, then paused. "It's good to see you well, Preston," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You look happy." Before he could respond, she continued on her way, leaving him standing in the middle of the street with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat. Happy. The word echoed in his mind as he watched her walk away. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to do when he left Riversbend all those years ago. He had land, cattle, respect. By all accounts, he should be happy. But watching Josephine disappear into the lawyer's office, Preston Wells knew with bone-deep certainty that he'd never be truly happy without her. The next morning, Preston rode out to the Taylor ranch at first light. He told himself he was just being neighborly, checking on the property that had been left untended since old man Taylor's death. But he knew the truth he needed to see the place where he and Josephine had grown up, where they had fallen in love, where he had promised to return for her someday. The Taylor Ranch wasn't large by Montana standards, but it had always been well maintained, a testament to James Taylor's hard work and dedication. Now, though, it showed signs of neglect. The corral fence needed mending, the barn roof had a hole in one corner, and the ranch house itself looked tired, its paint peeling in the harsh mountain weather. Preston dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post before approaching the house. Memories flooded back with each step helping Mr. Taylor brand calves in the spring, sharing Sunday dinners at the big oak table, stealing kisses with Josephine behind the barn when they thought no one was looking. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the rider approaching until the sound of hoofbeats brought him back to the present. Turning, he saw Josephine herself cantering toward the house on a chestnut mare. She rode astride, her skirts hitched up to reveal practical riding boots, her hair secured in a simple braid down her back. In that moment, she looked more like the Josie he remembered than the sophisticated woman from town, and his heart constricted painfully in his chest. She reined in her horse when she saw him, surprise evident on her face. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not dismounting. Preston gestured vaguely at the ranch. "I heard the place was sitting empty, thought I'd check if anything needed immediate attention." Josephine's expression softened slightly. "That's kind of you, but unnecessary. I've hired the Wilkins boys to look after things until the sale." She swung down from her horse with practiced ease, and Preston noticed that beneath the layers of Eastern refinement, she still moved with the natural grace of a woman raised on horseback. "You're really selling, then?" he asked, unable to keep the dismay from his voice. Josephine led her mare to the water trough before answering. "Yes, there's nothing for me here anymore." The words stung, but Preston couldn't argue with them. He had forfeited any right to challenge her decisions when he'd failed to keep his promise to return. "What about your fiancé?" he asked, the word bitter on his tongue. "Does he know what he's getting you away from?" Josephine's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with sudden anger. "You don't get to ask me about my personal life, Preston Wells, not after 7 years of silence." "I know," he said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry, that was out of line." She studied him for a long moment, her anger fading into something more complicated. "Why are you really here, Preston?" It was a fair question, one he wasn't entirely sure he could answer honestly, even to himself. "Because seeing you again has made me realize what a fool I've been. Because despite everything, you're still the only woman I've ever truly loved." "I wanted to apologize," he said instead, settling on the simplest truth. "For not writing, for not coming back when I said I would, for not being here when your father died." Josephine's expression remained guarded, but something in her eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "It was a long time ago. We were different people then. Were we?" Preston took a step closer, emboldened by the fact that she hadn't sent him away. "I remember a girl who could outride most of the ranch hands and who knew every constellation in the night sky. A girl who wasn't afraid to speak her mind or get her hands dirty. Is she really so different from the woman standing before me now?" A faint blush colored Josephine's cheeks. "People change, Preston. They grow up, they move on." "Some things don't change," he said quietly. "Some feelings don't fade, no matter how much time passes." Josephine looked away, her hands tightening on her horse's reins. "Don't, please, Josephine," he corrected himself. "I just want a chance to explain, to make things right between us if I can." She was silent for so long that Preston thought she might refuse. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "I'm staying for dinner," she said. "If you want to talk, you can join me, but I'm not making any promises about forgiveness or anything else." It was more than Preston had dared to hope for. "Thank you, I'll be here." She nodded, then led her horse toward the barn. "I need to check the property. I'll see you at 6. Preston watched her go, feeling a mixture of trepidation and hope. She hadn't forgiven him, might never forgive him, but she was willing to listen. It was a start. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Preston returned to the Taylor Ranch, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt. He'd brought a bottle of good whiskey and a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered from the meadow near his own property. He felt foolish carrying flowers like a nervous suitor, but some instinct told him that beneath Josephine's sophisticated exterior, the girl who had once pressed wildflowers between the pages of her journal might still exist. The ranch house looked different in the evening light, less neglected and more like the welcoming home Preston remembered. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. For a moment, he could almost imagine that the past 7 years had never happened, that he was calling on Josephine with her father's permission, that their future together was still untarnished by his broken promises. But reality asserted itself when Josephine opened the door. She had changed into a simple but elegant dress, her hair arranged in a style that was neither completely Eastern nor Western, a visual representation of the woman she had become, caught between two worlds. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the flowers, but she accepted them with a small smile. "Thank you, come in." The interior of the house was just as Preston remembered, though some of the furniture had been covered with sheets, lending the place a ghostly quality. Family photographs still adorned the walls, including one of Josephine as a young girl, sitting proudly on her first pony with her father standing beside her, beaming with pride. "It smells wonderful," Preston said, following Josephine to the kitchen. "Nothing fancy," she replied, taking a jar from a cabinet to serve as a vase for the wildflowers. "Just beef stew, my father's recipe." They worked together to set the table, falling into a rhythm that felt familiar despite the years apart. Preston uncorked the whiskey, pouring small glasses for each of them, while Josephine ladled stew into bowls and sliced bread still warm from the oven. When they finally sat down to eat, an awkward silence fell between them. There was too much to say, and neither seemed to know where to begin. "Your ranch is doing well," Josephine asked finally, breaking the silence. Preston nodded, grateful for the opening. "Better than I expected. Started with just a few head of cattle and built it up over the years. I have one of the larger spreads in the territory now. I heard, the Circle W Ranch. People speak highly of you in town." Preston shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I've been lucky, and I've had good men working for me." "That's not what I heard," Josephine said, a hint of her old directness showing through. "I heard you worked yourself half to death those first few years. That you took risks other ranchers wouldn't, that you built your success through sheer stubbornness." Preston smiled despite himself. "Maybe, but it wasn't just for me, you know. It was always for," he stopped, realizing too late where his words were leading. "For what?" Josephine prompted, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Preston met her gaze, deciding that if he'd come this far, he might as well speak the truth. "For you, for us. Everything I did, every sacrifice I made was so I could come back to you with something to offer, something worthy of you." Josephine set down her spoon, her expression unreadable. "Then why didn't you? Come back, I mean, or at least write to tell me your plans had changed." It was the question Preston had dreaded, yet the one he knew he needed to answer if there was any hope of making things right. "I was ashamed," he admitted, looking down at his untouched stew. "The first year was harder than I expected. I barely survived, let alone made my fortune. I kept thinking I'd write when things improved, when I had good news to share. But time passed, and the longer I waited, the harder it became to explain my silence." He took a breath, forcing himself to continue. "Then I heard you'd moved east to Boston. I figured you'd found a better life, someone better than a struggling rancher who couldn't keep his promises. I told myself it was for the best, that you deserved more than I could give you." "That wasn't your decision to make," Josephine said, her voice tight with emotion. "You didn't give me a choice, Preston. You just disappeared. Do you have any idea what that was like? Waiting for letters that never came, wondering if you were dead or alive. If you had found someone else." Preston winced at the pain in her voice. "I know I was wrong, so wrong, and I've regretted it every day since." Josephine was silent for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I waited 3 years, Preston. 3 years before I finally accepted that you weren't coming back. That's when I went to Boston to live with my aunt, to try to build a new life." "And you did," Preston said softly. "You're engaged now to a banker, I hear." Josephine looked down at her left hand, which Preston suddenly realized bore no ring. "Yes, Philip is a good man, kind, reliable. Do you love him?" The question escaped before Preston could stop it. Josephine's eyes flashed. "That's not a fair question, I know," Preston admitted. "I'm sorry." "I have no right to ask you that." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life," Preston said eventually. "I just wanted you to know the truth, that I never stopped thinking about you. That every success I achieved was hollow because you weren't there to share it." Josephine set down her napkin, her expression troubled. "What do you want from me, Preston? Forgiveness, absolution for breaking your promises. I can give you that if it will help you move on with your life. But if you're asking for something more—" "I'm not asking for anything," Preston interrupted. "I don't deserve to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that if I could go back and change things, I would." Josephine studied him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for some hidden truth. "The past can't be changed. We can only move forward." "I know," Preston agreed, his heart heavy, "and you have a future waiting for you in Boston, with Philip." Something flickered in Josephine's eyes, doubt, perhaps, or regret, but it was gone so quickly that Preston thought he might have imagined it. "Yes," she said, rising from the table. "I should start clearing up. It's getting late." Preston stood as well, recognizing the dismissal. "Let me help." "It's the least I can do." They washed and dried the dishes together in companionable silence, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times, the two of them working side by side, comfortable in each other's presence. As Preston handed her the last dried plate, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of awareness through him. Josephine must have felt it too, because she stepped back quickly, nearly dropping the plate. "Thank you for dinner," Preston said, breaking the charged moment, "and for listening." Josephine nodded, her composure restored. "Thank you for the flowers, and the whiskey." Preston reached for his hat, knowing it was time to leave but reluctant to end the evening. At the door, he turned back to her. "Josephine, I know you're planning to sell the ranch, but if you need any help with repairs or anything else before the sale, please let me know. No strings attached, I promise." A small smile touched her lips. "That's kind of you, I'll keep it in mind." Preston hesitated, wanting to say more but knowing he'd already pushed his luck. "Good night, then." "Good night, Preston." As he rode back to his own ranch under a canopy of stars, Preston replayed every moment of the evening in his mind. He had no right to hope, no claim on Josephine's heart after what he'd done. And yet, something in the way she'd looked at him, in the moments when her guard had slipped, gave him a flicker of hope that perhaps not everything was lost. She hadn't worn her engagement ring. It might mean nothing, perhaps she'd left it in town, or it was being sized, or any number of innocent explanations. But coupled with her hesitation when speaking of her fiancé, it planted a seed of possibility in Preston's mind. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make things right. The following days fell into an unexpected pattern. Each morning, Preston would ride out to the Taylor ranch, arriving just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. Each time, he half expected Josephine to turn him away, but she never did. Together, they worked on the repairs the ranch needed before it could be sold. Preston mended fences and patched the barn roof, while Josephine sorted through her father's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to sell with the property. They rarely spoke of the past or of Josephine's impending marriage, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. But as the days passed, Preston noticed subtle changes in Josephine. The formal, guarded woman who had stepped off the stagecoach began to give way to glimpses of the girl he'd once known. She laughed more freely, especially when they worked together with the horses. She stopped insisting on being called Josephine, responding naturally when he occasionally slipped and called her Josie. And once, when they broke for lunch after a particularly demanding morning, she told him stories about her time in Boston that revealed how out of place she had often felt in Eastern society. "The first time I attended a formal dinner, I used the wrong fork for the fish course," she confessed, eyes twinkling with self-deprecating humor. "My aunt was mortified, but Philip just switched his forks too so I wouldn't be the only one." "Sounds like a decent fellow," Preston said, ignoring the twist of jealousy in his gut. Josie's smile faded slightly. "He is very decent." There was something in her tone that Preston couldn't quite decipher, but before he could question it, she changed the subject. asking about changes to the town in her absence. A week into their new routine, Preston arrived at the ranch to find Josephine in the corral, working with a spirited black gelding that kept shying away from the saddle. "Need a hand," he called, leaning on the fence to watch. Josephine shook her head, determination written across her features. "I can manage. This one's just being stubborn." Preston watched as she approached the horse again, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. Her patience and gentle firmness reminded him of how she'd always had a way with difficult horses, even as a girl. "You haven't lost your touch," he observed as the gelding finally allowed her to place the saddle on its back. Josephine glanced over at him, a genuine smile lighting her face. "Some skills you don't forget, I suppose." The horse chose that moment to sidestep nervously, bumping into Josephine with enough force to send her stumbling backward. Preston vaulted over the fence without thinking, reaching her side in 3 long strides. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands steadying her shoulders. Josephine looked up at him, momentarily startled by his closeness. "I'm fine. Just lost my balance for a moment." Neither of them moved, caught in a moment of unexpected intimacy. Preston was acutely aware of his hands on her shoulders, of the warmth of her beneath the thin cotton of her shirt, of the way her breath quickened slightly. "Preston," she said softly, a warning in her voice. He dropped his hands immediately, stepping back. "Sorry." I know," she interrupted, turning back to the horse. "Thank you." The moment passed, but its effect lingered in the air between them for the rest of the day. They worked together more carefully, maintaining a deliberate distance that hadn't been necessary before. As evening approached, Preston saddled his horse to leave earlier than usual. The tension between them had grown uncomfortable, and he thought it best to give Josephine some space. "I'll come by tomorrow to finish the north fence," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Josephine nodded, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Preston," she was interrupted by the sound of an approaching rider. They both turned to see Sheriff Mackenzie cantering toward the ranch house, his expression serious. "Miss Taylor," he called as he drew closer. "Telegram came for you, from Boston." Josephine's face paled slightly as she accepted the folded paper from the sheriff. Preston watched as she read it, her expression changing from concern to something like relief. "Everything all right?" he asked when she looked up. "Yes," she said, tucking the telegram into her pocket. "It's from Philip. He's been delayed in Boston, business matters. He won't be arriving for another 2 weeks." Sheriff Mackenzie tipped his hat. "Well, I'll leave you folks to your evening. Just wanted to deliver that right away." As the sheriff rode off, Preston found himself studying Josephine's face, trying to read her reaction to the news. Was she disappointed, relieved? He couldn't tell. "I should go," he said finally, when it became clear she wasn't going to elaborate. Josephine looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I have a roast in the oven." The invitation surprised him after the awkwardness of the day. "Are you sure?" A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, I've gotten used to having company, I suppose." The simple admission warmed something inside Preston. Then I'd be honored. Dinner that night was different from their previous meals together. The tension that had built throughout the day had transformed into something else, an awareness of each other that made every glance, every accidental touch, charged with significance. They spoke of safe topics, the progress on the ranch repairs, the latest town gossip Sheriff Mackenzie had shared, the weather that promised rain in the coming days. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran an undercurrent of unspoken words and feelings. As they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Josephine broke their unspoken agreement not to discuss personal matters. "Why didn't you ever marry?" she asked, her voice quiet in the evening stillness. Preston took a sip of his whiskey before answering. "Never found anyone I wanted to marry, I suppose. In 7 years." Josephine's tone was gently skeptical. "A successful rancher like yourself must have had plenty of opportunities." Preston turned to look at her, deciding that the time for half-truths was past. "There were women, yes. But none of them were you, Josie. And I guess I never quite gave up hope that someday." He trailed off, not wanting to put into words the foolish dream he'd harbored all these years that somehow, someday, they might find their way back to each other. Josephine was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I almost didn't accept Philip's proposal," she said finally. "My aunt was horrified. He's from one of Boston's finest families, wealthy, respected. Everything a woman is supposed to want, and I do care for him deeply. He's been nothing but kind to me." "But," Preston prompted, hearing the unspoken word in her hesitation. Josephine looked down at her hands. "But sometimes I wonder if I said yes for the right reasons. If I'm marrying him because I truly want to spend my life with him, or because he represents the security and stability I've been searching for since I failed to provide it," Preston finished for her. She didn't deny it, which hurt more than any accusation could have. "We can't change the past, Preston." "No," he agreed, "but we can learn from it. I learned that some mistakes cost too much to ever be worth making, that some promises are too important to break no matter what." Josephine stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. "It's getting late." "You should go." Preston rose as well, recognizing that he'd pushed too far. "Josie, I'm not asking you to change your plans. I just want you to know that I understand now what I threw away, and that if I had it to do over again, I'd make very different choices." She didn't turn around, her back straight and tense. "Good night, Preston." He wanted to say more, to make her understand the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his feelings, but he recognized the dismissal for what it was. "Good night, Josie. I'll see you tomorrow." As he rode away, Preston looked back to see Josephine still standing on the porch, a solitary figure outlined against the warm light of the house. And though he had no right to hope, no claim on her future, he couldn't help but wonder if the door that had seemed so firmly closed might be opening, just a crack. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. Preston hesitated before riding out to the Taylor ranch, wondering if he should give Josephine more time to process their conversation from the night before. But the weather decided for him. If rain was coming, they needed to finish the barn roof repairs before it hit. He arrived to find Josephine already in the barn, sorting through old tack and tools. She greeted him with a reserved smile that gave no indication of her thoughts. "Morning," she said, nodding toward the darkening sky. "Looks like we're in for some weather." "That's why I came early," Preston replied, removing his hat. "Thought we should get that roof finished before the rain starts." They worked together throughout the morning, their conversation limited to the task at hand. The air between them was charged with unspoken words, but neither seemed willing to break the fragile peace they'd established. By midday, dark clouds had rolled in, bringing with them a sharp drop in temperature and a rising wind that whipped at their clothing and made working on the roof increasingly dangerous. "We should finish up," Preston called down to Josephine, who was handing him roofing nails from the ladder. "This storm's coming in faster than I thought." No sooner had he spoken than a bright flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Josephine gasped, her grip on the ladder faltering momentarily. "Careful." Preston shouted, but his warning came too late. A sudden gust of wind caught the ladder, tipping it away from the barn. Josephine cried out, scrambling for purchase as the ladder began to fall. Without thinking, Preston lunged for her, managing to grab her arm and pull her toward him as the ladder clattered to the ground. The sudden movement upset his own balance, and for a heart-stopping moment, they both teetered on the edge of the roof. Then Preston found his footing, pulling Josephine against him and away from the edge. They stood frozen, clinging to each other as the wind howled around them. Josephine's heart raced against Preston's chest, her breathing quick and shallow with fear. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe." Another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by the first heavy drops of rain. They needed to get down from the roof, but the ladder was now lying on the ground below them. "We'll have to jump to that hay wagon," Preston said, pointing to a wagon parked nearby. "It's not too far and the hay will break our fall." Josephine nodded, still pale but composed. "You go first, show me it's safe." Preston hesitated, reluctant to let her go. "Together, I won't leave you up here alone." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, trust, perhaps, or recognition of the words that echoed from their past. "I won't leave you." "All right," Josephine said. "Together." They moved to the edge of the roof, the rain now falling in earnest, making the wooden shingles slick beneath their boots. Preston kept his arm around Josephine's waist, anchoring her to him. "On three," he said. "1, 2, 3. They jumped, the momentary sensation of falling giving way to the soft impact of the hay wagon beneath them. Preston twisted as they fell, taking the brunt of the landing on his back with Josephine sprawled on top of him. For a moment they lay there, breathless and stunned, the rain pouring down around them. Then Josephine raised her head, her face inches from Preston's, and began to laugh, a genuine, unreserved sound of relief and exhilaration that he hadn't heard from her since his return. Preston couldn't help but join her, the tension of the moment breaking into shared laughter. As their mirth subsided, they became acutely aware of their position, Josephine lying on top of Preston, their bodies pressed together, faces close enough that he could feel her breath on his lips. The laughter died in Josephine's throat, replaced by something else entirely. Her eyes dropped to Preston's mouth, then back to his eyes, a question in her gaze. "Josie," he whispered, reaching up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face. The gesture broke whatever spell had fallen over them. Josephine pulled back, rolling off him and onto the hay beside him. "We should get inside," she said, her voice unsteady, "before we're completely soaked." Preston sat up, knowing the moment had passed but unable to forget the look in her eyes. "You're right." They made a dash for the house, the rain now coming down in sheets, turning the yard into a muddy quagmire. By the time they reached the porch, they were both drenched, their clothes clinging to their skin. "You need to get out of those wet things," Josephine said, practical despite the flush in her cheeks. "I think some of my father's clothes are still in his room. They might fit you." Preston nodded, following her into the house. She led him to a bedroom off the main hallway, opening a wardrobe to reveal neatly hung men's clothing. "I'll change in my room," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "There are towels in the drawer of the washstand." She left him then, closing the door behind her. Preston stood dripping on the floor, his mind still reeling from the moment they'd shared in the hay wagon. Had he imagined the look in her eyes, the way she'd glanced at his lips, or had Josephine been thinking, just for a moment, of kissing him? He changed quickly into James Taylor's clothes, a flannel shirt and sturdy trousers that were slightly too short, but otherwise fit well enough. The intimacy of wearing her father's clothing wasn't lost on him, nor was the trust Josephine had shown in offering them. When he emerged from the bedroom, he found Josephine in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cook stove. She had changed into a simple blue dress, her wet hair braided and hanging down her back. The sight of her, domestic and slightly disheveled, stirred something deep within Preston, a longing for what might have been, for the life they might have shared. "The storm's getting worse," she said, glancing out the window at the driving rain. "You might have to stay until it passes." "I don't want to impose," Preston said, though the thought of riding home in the storm held little appeal. Josephine shook her head. "It's not an imposition. It would be irresponsible to send anyone out in weather like this." She paused, a small smile touching her lips. "Even someone as stubborn as you." The teasing note in her voice eased some of the tension between them. "I seem to recall you being the stubborn one, Miss Taylor, especially when it came to breaking in new horses." Her smile widened at the memory. "We were both stubborn. My father used to say we were two sides of the same coin, equally hard-headed, just in different ways." The mention of her father brought a shadow of grief to her eyes, and Preston instinctively moved closer, wanting to comfort her but unsure if his touch would be welcome. "He was proud of you, you know," he said softly. "Every letter I got from him in those first few years, he'd talk about how well you were doing, how you were becoming a fine young woman." Josephine looked up at him, surprise evident in her expression. "You wrote to my father." Preston nodded, suddenly realizing he'd revealed something he hadn't intended to. "For a while, yes. Not as often as I should have, but we kept in touch." "He never told me," Josephine said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. "I asked him not to," Preston admitted. "I thought it would be easier for you to move on if you believed I'd truly gone from your life, and later, when I heard you'd gone east, I figured you had." Josephine was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire in the cook stove. "He mentioned you sometimes, that you were doing well, that you'd started your own ranch, but he never said you were in contact. I'm sorry, Preston said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for: the secrecy, the years of silence, or the pain he'd clearly caused her. Josephine closed the stove door with more force than necessary. It doesn't matter now, that was a long time ago, but her tone suggested otherwise, and Preston knew he'd inadvertently opened old wounds. Josie, she turned to face him, her expression guarded once more. I should start dinner. If you're staying, you might as well make yourself useful. There's kindling that needs chopping in the mudroom. Preston recognized the dismissal and nodded, accepting that Josephine needed space to process this new information. Of course. As he made his way to the mudroom, Preston wondered if he'd just undone all the progress they'd made over the past week. The revelation that he'd maintained contact with her father while deliberately cutting her from his life might be the final blow to any hope of reconciliation. And yet, as he split kindling for the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sounds of Josephine moving about the kitchen, Preston couldn't help but feel that they had crossed some invisible threshold. For better or worse, the truth was beginning to emerge piece by painful piece. And perhaps, just perhaps, the truth might set them both free. The storm showed no signs of abating as evening fell. If anything, it intensified, with wind howling around the eaves of the house and rain beating a relentless tattoo on the roof. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening rooms, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ranch house. Dinner was a quiet affair, both Preston and Josephine lost in their own thoughts. The revelation about Preston's correspondence with her father hung between them, unaddressed but impossible to ignore. As they cleared the table afterward, Preston finally broke the silence. I should have told you I was writing to your father. It wasn't fair to either of you to ask him to keep secrets. Josephine continued washing dishes for a moment before responding. No, it wasn't, but I understand why you did it. You were trying to make a clean break. That doesn't make it right, Preston said, taking the plate she handed him to dry. No, she agreed, meeting his eyes briefly. It doesn't. They finished the dishes in silence, the storm providing a dramatic backdrop to their quiet domestic task. When everything was put away, they stood awkwardly in the kitchen, neither quite sure what to do next. The spare bedroom is made up, Josephine said finally. You're welcome to turn in whenever you like. I think I'll sit up for a while. I've never been able to sleep well during storms. Preston nodded, remembering how thunderstorms had always made her restless, even as a girl. I remember. You used to say you could feel the electricity in the air, that it made your skin buzz. A small smile touched Josephine's lips, surprise and something like pleasure in her eyes that he had remembered such a detail. Yes, it still does. Would you like company? Preston asked, then quickly added, I mean, if you're going to be up anyway, we could talk, or not talk. Whatever you prefer. Josephine hesitated, then nodded. I was going to have tea in the sitting room. You're welcome to join me. The sitting room was the heart of the Taylor home, a comfortable space filled with well-worn furniture and family mementos. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room and holding the storm-induced darkness at bay. Josephine busied herself preparing tea while Preston added another log to the fire. When she returned with a tray bearing a teapot and 2 cups, he was studying the photographs on the mantelpiece, images of Josephine at various ages, of her parents on their wedding day, and one of Josephine and Preston themselves, taken at a town picnic the summer before he left. In the photograph, they were laughing, Preston's arms slung casually around Josephine's shoulders. They looked young, carefree, and unmistakably in love, though neither had spoken the words aloud at that point. I'd forgotten about this, Preston said softly as Josephine set the tray on a small table. She glanced at the photograph, a shadow passing over her face. I almost packed it away with the others, but it seemed wrong somehow to hide away the memories just because they're painful. Preston replaced the photograph carefully. Are they painful, I mean? Josephine poured tea into delicate cups, her movements precise and controlled. They were, for a long time. She handed him a cup, her fingers brushing his briefly. Now they're just memories, neither good nor bad. Just part of who I was, who I became. Preston accepted the tea, grateful for something to do with his hands. And who did you become, Josie? In Boston, I mean, when you were away from all this. He gestured to encompass the ranch, the storm-lashed wilderness beyond the windows. Josephine settled into an armchair, tucking her feet beneath her in a gesture so familiar that it made Preston's heart ache. Someone different. Someone who learned to navigate society dinners and make small talk with bankers' wives. Someone who wore corsets so tight they left marks and who never, ever mentioned that she once knew how to birth a calf or shoot a rattlesnake. There was a hint of bitterness in her tone that Preston had never heard before. You didn't fit in. Not really. Not at first. Josephine sipped her tea, her gaze distant. But I adapted. That's what we do, isn't it? We adapt to survive. I became what was expected of me. A proper lady. Someone worthy of Philip Harrington Roman IV. The way she said her fiancé's name with its formal numerals carried a wealth of unspoken meaning. And is that who you want to be? A proper Boston lady? Mrs. Philip Harrington IV? Josephine's eyes snapped to his, a flash of the old fire in them. It's not that simple, Preston. You can't just walk back into my life after 7 years and question the choices I've made. The life I've built. I'm not questioning your choices, Preston said, setting down his teacup. I'm asking if they've made you happy. The directness of the question seemed to catch Josephine off guard. She looked away, her profile illuminated by a flash of lightning through the window. Happiness isn't always the most important thing, she said finally. Security matters, stability matters. Knowing where you stand and what to expect from life, those things matter too. They do, Preston agreed. But they're not enough on their own, not for a lifetime. Josephine turned back to him, her expression challenging. And what would you know about a lifetime, Preston Wells? You who couldn't even keep a promise for a year, the words struck home, sharp and true. I deserved that, Preston acknowledged, and you're right. I have no standing to advise you on your life choices, but I know you, Josie, or at least I knew you once. And the woman I knew wouldn't settle for security and stability if they came at the cost of her happiness. Josephine's eyes glistened with sudden tears. The woman you knew was a girl. A foolish, romantic girl who believed in promises and happy endings. She learned better. Did she? Preston leaned forward, his voice gentle. Or did she just build walls to protect herself from being hurt again? A tear slipped down Josephine's cheek, and she brushed it away impatiently. What does it matter now? I've made my choice. Philip is a good man. He loves me. He'll give me a good life. But do you love him? Preston asked, echoing the question she had avoided days earlier. Josephine stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the storm-tossed night. I care for him deeply. I respect him. I enjoy his company. That's not what I asked, Preston said quietly, rising to stand behind her. Josephine's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. Love isn't always what the storybooks make it out to be. Sometimes it's quieter, more practical. And sometimes, Preston said, close enough now that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. It's like a summer storm, wild and unpredictable and powerful enough to change the landscape forever. Josephine turned then, her eyes meeting his. They were so close that Preston could see the flecks of gold in her brown irises, could count each tear clinging to her lashes. I can't do this again, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't give you the power to hurt me like that again. I wouldn't, Preston promised, his heart in his throat. Not ever. I've learned my lesson, Josie. 7 years without you taught me exactly what I threw away. I wouldn't make that mistake twice. Josephine shook her head, tears falling freely now. You say that now, but how can I trust it? How can I trust you? You can't, Preston admitted. Not yet. Trust has to be earned, and I haven't earned yours back, but I'm asking for the chance to try. Just a chance, Josie, that's all. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, revealing the conflict in her eyes, longing warring with fear, hope battling with hard-won caution. I'm engaged, Preston, she said, though the words seemed to cost her. I gave my word to Philip. I can't just break your promise. Preston finished for her. The way I broke mine, Josephine flinched as if he'd struck her. That's not fair. No, it's not, he agreed. None of this is fair. Not what I did to you, not the position you're in now. But life isn't fair, Josie. We both know that. The question is, what are we going to do about it? She looked up at him, vulnerability and uncertainty in her gaze. I don't know, Preston took a careful step closer, not touching her but close enough that she would feel the heat of his body. Yes, you do. You've always known your own mind, Josie. Even when we were kids. You never let anyone, not your father, not your teachers, not me, tell you what to think or how to feel. That's one of the things I've always loved about you. The word hung in the air between them, loved, simple and profound, and weighted with 7 years of regret and longing. Preston, Josephine whispered, his name both a plea and a warning. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I never stopped loving you, Josie, not for a single day. I tried. God knows I tried, but you're part of me, always have been, always will be. Josephine closed her eyes, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. I tried to hate you, she confessed, her voice barely audible over the storm. When you didn't come back, when your letters stopped coming, I tried so hard to hate you. Did it work? Preston asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Josephine opened her eyes, and in them, Preston saw the answer before she spoke. No, she whispered. I couldn't hate you. No matter how much it would have simplified things. Preston's hand cupped her cheek fully now, and Josephine didn't pull away. Nothing about this is simple, he said. But some things are true, regardless of how complicated they are, and the truth is, I love you, Josephine Taylor. I've loved you since we were 16 years old, and I'll love you until the day I die. A sob escaped Josephine's throat, and she pressed her hand over his on her cheek. Preston, whatever she had been about to say was lost as a tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, so loud and sudden that they both jumped. It was followed immediately by a splintering sound from outside and the unmistakable hiss of rain on hot embers. The barn. Josephine cried, pulling away from Preston to look out the window. Lightning must have struck it. Preston followed her gaze and saw orange flames beginning to lick at one corner of the barn roof, visible even through the driving rain. The horses, he said, already moving toward the door. We have to get them out. They raced outside into the storm, the rain instantly soaking them to the skin. The barn was indeed on fire, flames spreading rapidly despite the downpour. Preston could hear the frightened whinnies of the horses inside. Stay back, he shouted to Josephine over the storm. I'll get them out. But Josephine was already running toward the barn doors, heedless of the danger. There are 4 horses in there, you can't manage them all alone. Preston knew she was right, but fear for her safety made him want to argue. There was no time, however. The fire was spreading faster than he would have thought possible, the dry timber of the old barn feeding the flames despite the rain. Together, they pulled open the barn doors, coughing as smoke billowed out to meet them. Inside, the horses were frantic, kicking at their stall doors and rolling their eyes in terror. You take Midnight and Thunder, Josephine shouted, already moving toward the stalls where her chestnut mare and the black gelding were housed. I'll get Diamond and Star. Preston wanted to protest. The far side of the barn, where the other 2 horses were stalled, was already thick with smoke, but he knew there was no time to argue. He hurried to release Midnight, who bolted past him the moment the stall door was open. Thunder was more difficult, rearing and fighting in his panic. Easy, boy, Preston soothed, managing to grab the horse's halter and lead him toward the door. Easy now. Through the thickening smoke, he could see Josephine struggling with Diamond, a dappled gray who was too terrified to move from his stall. The roof above them creaked ominously, sparks and burning debris beginning to fall. Josie, Preston called, fear making his voice sharp. Get out of there. The roof's going to come down. Not without the horses, she shouted back, still trying to coax Diamond forward. Preston led Thunder out of the barn, releasing him into the paddock before rushing back inside. The heat was becoming unbearable, the smoke so thick that he could barely see. Josie. He called again, coughing as he inhaled smoke. Here. Her voice came from the far end of the barn where Star's stall was located. Diamond's out, but Star's trapped. The roof collapsed in front of her stall. Preston fought his way through the smoke, following the sound of Josephine's voice. He found her trying to clear a path through burning timbers, her dress already singed in several places. We have to go, he shouted, grabbing her arm. Now, before the whole thing comes down on us. I can't leave her, Josephine cried, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. Preston looked at the mare, trapped in her stall with no way out. The horse's eyes were wide with terror, her coat already scorched in places. Making a split-second decision, Preston pulled Josephine away from the debris. "Get out," he ordered. "I'll get Star, but you have to go now." Josephine hesitated, clearly torn between leaving him and saving herself. "Preston, go," he shouted, giving her a gentle push toward the door. "I promise I'll be right behind you." Something in his voice, perhaps the echo of another promise, one long broken, seemed to reach her. Josephine nodded once, then turned and ran for the door, coughing as she went. Once she was out of sight, Preston turned back to the trapped horse. The situation was dire. Burning timbers blocked the front of the stall, and the roof above was creaking ominously. But there was another way. "Easy, girl," he murmured, moving to the back wall of the stall. The wood here was old and weathered, weakened by years of the horse leaning against it. With enough force, it might give way. Preston backed up as far as the narrow aisle would allow, then charged at the wall, hitting it with his shoulder. Pain exploded through his arm, but the wood cracked. He repeated the action, ignoring the agony in his shoulder and the burning in his lungs from the smoke. On the third try, the wall gave way with a splintering crash. Star reared in terror, but Preston caught her halter, speaking soothingly despite the urgency of their situation. "Come on, girl. This way." He led the horse through the gap in the wall into the small paddock behind the barn. From there, they could circle around to safety. They had barely cleared the barn when a tremendous crash announced the collapse of the entire roof. Preston looked back to see the structure fully engulfed in flames, beyond saving now. Through the rain and smoke, he spotted Josephine standing with the other horses at a safe distance, her face pale with fear as she searched for him. When she saw him emerging from the smoke with Star, she ran toward them, relief written across her features. "You're alive," she cried, throwing her arms around him, heedless of the soot and ash that covered him. "When I heard the roof collapse, I promised I'd be right behind you," Preston said, wincing as her embrace pressed against his injured shoulder. "I meant to keep that one." Josephine pulled back, noticing his pain. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Preston assured her, though his shoulder throbbed mercilessly. "Just bruised from breaking through the wall." They stood in the rain, watching as the barn burned, beyond saving now. Star moved to join the other horses, who had huddled together in the far corner of the paddock, away from the fire. "At least we got them all out," Josephine said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Preston nodded, suddenly aware of how close they had come to disaster. "We should get inside." "You need to get warm and dry." Josephine looked up at him, rain mingling with tears on her face. "You saved Star. You could have been killed, but you saved her." "I made a promise," Preston said simply. "This time I kept it." Something shifted in Josephine's expression, a softening, a surrender of sorts. Without warning, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, desperate kiss that conveyed everything words could not. When she pulled back, her eyes were wide with the implications of what she had done. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." Preston silenced her with another kiss. Deeper this time, 7 years of longing poured into a single moment. Josephine melted against him, her arms twining around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, rain streaming down their faces and steam rising from their soaked clothing. "We should go inside," Preston said again, his voice rough with emotion. Josephine nodded, unable to speak. They walked back to the house hand in hand, leaving the burning barn behind them. Whatever came next, whatever choices lay ahead, they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. And for the first time in 7 years, Preston felt hope blossoming in his chest, hope that perhaps, despite everything, they might find their way back to each other after all. The house was a welcome refuge from the storm and the chaos of the barn fire. Inside, they stood dripping on the entryway floor, suddenly awkward in the aftermath of their passionate moment outside. "You need to change," Josephine said, her voice still rough from the smoke. "Your shoulder should be looked at too." Preston nodded, acutely aware of the pain radiating from his shoulder down his arm. "It's not too bad, probably just bruised." Josephine gave him a skeptical look. "Let me be the judge of that. My father taught me enough about injuries to know when something's more serious than it appears." She led him to the kitchen, where the fire in the cookstove still provided warmth. "Take off your shirt. I'll get some hot water and bandages." Preston raised an eyebrow at the command, a hint of his old humor returning despite the pain. "You've gotten bossy in your time away, Miss Taylor." A faint blush colored Josephine's cheeks, but she held her ground. Someone has to be sensible, and it clearly isn't going to be the man who ran back into a burning barn. Preston couldn't argue with that logic. While Josephine busied herself heating water and gathering medical supplies, he gingerly removed his borrowed shirt, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. When Josephine returned, she drew in a sharp breath at the sight of his bare torso. Preston glanced down, following her gaze, and saw that his shoulder was already turning an angry purple, the bruising extending down his upper arm. "It looks worse than it is," he assured her, though in truth, the pain was considerable. Josephine set down her supplies and approached him, her expression professional despite the intimacy of the situation. "Let me see." Her touch was gentle as she examined his shoulder, fingers probing carefully for signs of broken bones or dislocation. Preston tried to focus on the pain rather than the warmth of her hands on his skin, but it was a losing battle. "I don't think anything's broken," she said finally. "But you've bruised it badly. It needs to be wrapped, and you should keep from using it too much for the next few days." Preston nodded, watching as she dipped a cloth in hot water and began to clean the soot and dirt from his skin. Her movements were efficient but tender, and he found himself studying her face as she worked the small furrow between her brows as she concentrated, the way she bit her lower lip when she encountered a particularly stubborn smudge. "You're staring," she murmured, not looking up from her task. "Can you blame me?" Preston replied softly. "You're beautiful, Josie, you always have been." The blush returned to her cheeks, deeper this time. "Hold still, I need to wrap this properly." Preston obediently remained motionless as she applied a salve to the bruising and began to wrap his shoulder with long strips of clean cloth. The domesticity of the moment, Josephine tending to his wounds in the warm kitchen while rain pattered against the windows, stirred something deep within him, a longing for what might have been. "I'm sorry about the barn," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Josephine's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "It's just a building. It can be rebuilt. The horses are safe, that's what matters. Still, it's one more thing to deal with before you can sell the place." Josephine tied off the bandage and stepped back to inspect her work. "Yes, well, perhaps it's a sign." "A sign?" Preston asked, carefully testing the range of motion in his shoulder. The bandage was tight but not restrictive, supporting the injured joint perfectly. Josephine began putting away her supplies, her back to him. "That I'm not meant to sell." "Not yet, anyway." Preston's heart quickened at her words, but he was careful not to read too much into them. "What about Boston? Your fiancé?" Josephine turned to face him, her expression troubled. "I don't know, Preston. Everything seemed so clear before I came back here, before I saw you again." "And now," he prompted gently. She sighed, leaning against the counter. "Now nothing is clear, except that I can't simply pretend this evening didn't happen, that kiss didn't happen." Preston stood, moving closer to her despite the voice of caution in his head warning him not to push too far, too fast. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Josie, but I can't pretend either. Not anymore. Not after coming so close to losing you again tonight." Josephine looked up at him, conflict evident in her eyes. "What are we doing, Preston? What is this?" "I think," he said carefully, "we're finding our way back to each other, or at least I hope we are." Josephine closed her eyes briefly as if gathering her strength. "I need time to think. To figure out what I truly want." "Of course," Preston agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere this time." She opened her eyes, studying his face as if searching for any sign of insincerity. "What if I decide that I still want to marry Philip? That my future lies in Boston?" The question hurt, but Preston knew she deserved an honest answer. "Then I'll wish you every happiness, Josie. All I've ever wanted is for you to be happy, even if it's not with me." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "When did you get so wise and selfless?" "Around the same time I realized what a fool I'd been to let you go," Preston replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Some lessons are learned the hard way." Josephine reached up, her fingers lightly tracing the line of his jaw. "You should get some rest." "It's been a long night and your shoulder needs time to heal." Preston caught her hand in his, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "What about you? Will you sleep?" "Eventually," she said. "I want to check on the horses first, make sure they're settled after the excitement." "I'll come with you," Preston offered immediately. Josephine shook her head. "No, you need to rest that shoulder. The horses are fine in the paddock for now. I just want to make sure they have fresh water and some shelter from the rain." Preston knew better than to argue with her determined expression. "All right, but don't stay out in this weather too long." "I won't," she promised, retrieving an oilskin coat from a hook by the door. "Get some sleep, Preston. We can talk more in the morning." After she left, Preston made his way to the spare bedroom, exhaustion suddenly washing over him now that the adrenaline of the fire had faded. His shoulder throbbed dully as he carefully lay down on the bed, not bothering to remove his borrowed trousers. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to abate, the thunder moving off into the distance and the rain softening to a gentle patter against the window. Preston stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in his mind. The barn was gone, but all 4 horses had been saved. He had been injured, but not seriously. And Josephine had responded to his kiss with a passion that suggested her feelings for him were far from dead. It wasn't a resolution, not by any means. Josephine was still engaged to another man. She still had decisions to make, a life in Boston to consider. But for the first time since his return to Riverspend, Preston allowed himself to truly hope that maybe, just maybe, they might have a second chance after all. With that hope warming his heart, he drifted into sleep, dreaming of Josephine Taylor and the future they might yet build together. Preston awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sound of a hammer striking wood. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and the pain in his shoulder confusing him. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back: the storm, the fire, Josephine's kiss. He sat up carefully, wincing as his bruised shoulder protested the movement. Through the window, he could see the blackened remains of the barn silhouetted against a clear blue sky. And beside it, a figure in a simple work dress, driving nails into what appeared to be the beginnings of a makeshift shelter: Josephine. She must have been up for hours already, working while he slept. Preston dressed quickly, using James Taylor's clothes again since his own were still damp from the previous night's soaking. He made his way outside, squinting in the bright morning sunlight. Josephine didn't notice his approach at first, focused as she was on her task. She had managed to construct a simple lean-to using salvaged lumber from the barn, providing the horses with shade and protection from the elements. The 4 animals grazed peacefully nearby, seemingly recovered from their ordeal. "You should have woken me," Preston said, announcing his presence. "I could have helped." Josephine turned, hammer still in hand, a few strands of hair escaping from her practical braid. She looked tired but determined, and Preston thought he had never seen anyone more beautiful. "Your shoulder needed rest," she replied, setting down the hammer. "Besides, I'm perfectly capable of building a simple shelter." "I never doubted it," Preston assured her, approaching to inspect her handiwork. "Though I'm impressed, this is solid construction." A small smile touched Josephine's lips. "My father taught me well, said a woman on her own should know how to handle basic repairs." "A wise man," Preston agreed, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "How are you this morning, besides clearly industrious?" Josephine's smile faded, her expression growing more serious. "I've been thinking, all night really." Preston's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice calm. And she gestured toward the bench she had positioned near the new shelter. "Let's sit. My back is aching from all this hammering." They sat side by side, looking out over the ranch that had been Josephine's childhood home. The land spread out before them, bathed in morning sunlight, rolling pastures, stands of pine trees in the distance, and beyond them, the majestic peaks of the mountains. "I can't marry Philip," Josephine said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "I realized that last night, watching you run back into a burning building to save a horse because you'd promised me you would. It made me see everything clearly." Preston hardly dared breathe, afraid to break the moment. "What did you see?" Josephine turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That I've been hiding from my true self for years, pretending to be someone I'm not because it was easier than facing the pain of losing you. That I was prepared to marry a man I respect and admire, but don't truly love because it felt safe. She took a shaky breath before continuing. And I saw that despite everything, despite 7 years of silence, despite all the pain and anger and disappointment, you're still the only man who knows the real me. The only man I've ever truly loved. Preston's heart soared at her words, but he forced himself to proceed cautiously. Josie, I don't want you to make this decision based on one moment of crisis. Last night was emotional for both of us. The danger, the fire, it wasn't just last night, Josephine interrupted, a hint of her old fire flashing in her eyes. It's been building since the moment I saw you again in town. Last night merely forced me to stop pretending, to face what I've known deep down all along. She reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. I never stopped loving you, Preston. I tried. God knows I tried, but you're in my blood, in my bones. You always have been. Preston brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I love you, Josie. I always have, always will. But what about Philip? Your life in Boston? A shadow passed over Josephine's face. I need to write to Philip today. He deserves to know the truth, to hear it directly from me. As for Boston, she glanced around at the ranch, at the mountains in the distance. I never truly belonged there. I was just pretending. This is home. It always has been. And us? Preston asked, hardly daring to hope. What happens now? A small smile curved Josephine's lips. Now we rebuild. The barn, first of all, and then, us, our relationship. It won't be easy, Preston. There's still a lot of hurt between us, a lot of lost time to account for. I know, he agreed, squeezing her hand gently. And I'll spend the rest of my life making up for those lost years if you'll let me. Josephine's smile widened, the first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her since his return. I'm counting on it, Cowboy. Preston laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Does this mean you're not selling the ranch? No, Josephine said, her expression turning thoughtful. At least not all of it. I was thinking, what if we combined our lands? Your ranch borders this one to the north. Together, they'd make one of the largest spreads in the territory. The casual "we" in her statement sent a thrill through Preston. Are you proposing a business arrangement, Miss Taylor? A faint blush colored Josephine's cheeks. Perhaps, among other things. Preston's smile faded into something more serious, more intense. Josie, I want to do this right this time. No rushed promises, no leaving. I want to court you properly, the way I should have 7 years ago. Josephine's eyes softened. I'd like that. But Preston, we're not the same people we were back then. We need to get to know each other again, to make sure that what we feel isn't just an echo of the past. Agreed, Preston said, relieved that she was approaching this with the same caution he felt. We take it slow, one day at a time. One day at a time, Josephine repeated, a promise in her voice. Preston leaned forward, drawn to her like a moth to flame. Starting with today. Josephine met him halfway, her lips finding his in a sweet, tender kiss that held all the promise of new beginnings. Starting with today, she murmured against his mouth. When they broke apart, Preston noticed that the horses had wandered closer, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Josephine laughed, the sound pure and joyful in the morning air. I think they approve, she said, gesturing toward the animals. Preston stood, pulling her up with him. They always did have good sense. Now, how about breakfast, and then we can start planning that new barn. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, the future stretching out before them like the Montana sky, vast and bright and full of possibility. In the weeks that followed, Preston and Josephine fell into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Preston would ride over from his ranch, and together they would work on rebuilding the barn. In the afternoons, they would ride the boundaries of their combined properties, making plans for improvements, and discussing how best to merge their operations. And in the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the Taylor ranch house, watching the sunset and talking about the years they had spent apart, the people they had become, and the future they hoped to build together. Josephine had written to Philip immediately, a long, honest letter explaining her change of heart. His response, when it arrived 2 weeks later, was gracious if understandably hurt. He had released her from their engagement and wished her well, a kindness that left Josephine both relieved and guilty. "He's a good man," she told Preston one evening as they sat side by side on the porch swing. "He deserves someone who loves him completely." Preston nodded, his arm draped comfortably around her shoulders. "As do you." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I have that now." The new barn rose steadily from the ashes of the old, larger and sturdier than its predecessor. Word of the fire had spread through Riverspend, and neighbors had shown up to help with the raising, turning what could have been weeks of work into days. Sheriff Mackenzie had been among the volunteers, his knowing smile when he saw Preston and Josephine working side by side, suggesting that he wasn't entirely surprised by the turn of events. "Always knew you two would find your way back to each other," he told Preston as they worked together setting roof beams. "Some things are just meant to be." As August faded into September, and the first hints of autumn touched the Montana landscape, Preston and Josephine's relationship deepened and strengthened. The caution with which they had approached their reconciliation gave way to a comfortable certainty, a knowledge that what they had found together was real and lasting. They were sitting by the fireplace one evening, discussing plans for the upcoming cattle drive, when Preston suddenly fell silent, a contemplative look on his face. "What is it?" Josephine asked, noticing his distraction. Preston reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, worn leather pouch. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. But I'm beginning to think there's no such thing as a perfect moment, just perfect certainty." Josephine set aside the ledger she had been reviewing, her attention fully captured. "Preston." He opened the pouch, tipping its contents into his palm. A ring gleamed in the firelight, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond, flanked by two small sapphires. "This was my mother's," Preston said, his voice quiet with emotion. "My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for the woman I wanted to spend my life with." Josephine's breath caught in her throat as Preston slid from his chair to kneel before her. "I've loved you since we were 16 years old, Josie Taylor. Lost you once through my own foolishness and by some miracle found my way back to you. I don't intend to waste this second chance." He took her hand in his, the ring held between them like a promise. "I'm not the same man who left you 7 years ago. I hope I'm better, wiser, more patient, more appreciative of what truly matters. But one thing hasn't changed. You are the only woman I've ever loved, the only one I ever will love." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes as Preston continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "I'm not asking you to forgive the past. I'm asking you to build a future with me, to be my wife, my partner, my heart's true home. Will you marry me, Josie?" Josephine's free hand came up to touch his face, tracing the features that had become so dear to her once again. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Preston Wells, I will marry you." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, the gold warm against her skin. Preston rose, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with all the love and promise of their shared future. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Josephine rested her forehead against his. "I never thought we'd get here," she admitted. "After everything that happened, all the years apart." "I always hoped," Preston confessed. "Even when I told myself it was impossible, that you'd moved on and forgotten me. Some part of me never stopped believing that someday, somehow, we'd find our way back to each other." Josephine smiled, remembering the words of Sheriff Mackenzie. "Some things are just meant to be." They were married on a crisp October day, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the deep blue Montana sky. The ceremony took place on the land where their combined ranch houses stood, with the newly completed barn as a backdrop and the mountains bearing witness. Sheriff Mackenzie had the honor of giving Josephine away, her father's absence keenly felt, but his memory honored in every detail of the day. The townspeople of Riverspend turned out in force, celebrating the union of two of their own who had found their way home at last. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of autumn flowers, Preston held Josephine's hands in his eyes never leaving hers. "I, Preston James Wells, take you, Josephine Marie Taylor, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice strong and clear. To have and to hold, from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts us. He paused, then added words that weren't part of the traditional vows but came straight from his heart. I promise to cherish every day we have together, to never again take for granted the gift of your love, and to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the second chance you've given me. Tears shimmered in Josephine's eyes as she responded with her own vows, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her face. I, Josephine Marie Taylor, take you, Preston James Wells, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold, from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts us. She squeezed his hands, adding her own personal promise. I vow to build our life together on a foundation of trust and honesty, to face whatever challenges come our way as partners and equals, and to love you freely and completely every day of our lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston gathered Josephine into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future filled with love. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the territory. As evening fell, lanterns were lit around the property, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Preston found Josephine standing slightly apart from the celebration, looking out over their land, the rolling pastures now touched with autumn gold, the distant mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. Having second thoughts, Mrs. Wells? He asked, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Josephine leaned back against him, covering his hands with her own. Not one, just thinking about how far we've come, how close we came to missing this. Preston pressed a kiss to her temple. But we didn't miss it. That's what matters. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had been her first love and was now her husband. I was thinking about something else too. Oh, Preston raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the hint of mischief in her eyes. And what might that be? That barn of ours is finally finished, Josephine said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Seems a shame not to put it to good use. Preston laughed, the sound rich with happiness. Are you suggesting we abandon our own wedding celebration, Mrs. Wells? Just for a little while, Josephine replied, her eyes sparkling in the lantern light. No one will miss us, and I've been waiting 7 years to be alone with my husband. Preston's expression softened, love and desire evident in his gaze. When you put it that way, how can I refuse? Hand in hand, they slipped away from the celebration, making their way toward the new barn. Inside, the fresh-cut timber still carried the scent of pine, mingling with the sweet smell of hay that filled the loft. In the soft glow of a single lantern, Preston drew Josephine into his arms, kissing her with all the love and longing of 7 years apart. And as they came together as husband and wife, the past with all its pain and misunderstandings finally gave way completely to the promise of their future, a future they would build together, one day at a time, on the land they both loved. 10 years later, Preston Wells stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as his wife led their oldest son through the basics of roping a calf. At 8 years old, James Preston Wells had his father's determined jaw and his mother's quick mind, a combination that both delighted and occasionally exasperated his parents. Nearby, their 6-year-old daughter, Catherine, was carefully brushing her pony under the watchful eye of her grandfather, Sheriff Mackenzie, now retired and a frequent visitor to the Wells Ranch. And toddling after them all on chubby legs was 3-year-old Thomas, determined not to be left out of any family activity. The Circle W Ranch, as they had named their combined properties, had prospered beyond even Preston's ambitious dreams. Their cattle operation was now one of the largest in Montana territory, their breeding stock sought after throughout the West. The original Taylor ranch house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, while Preston's former bachelor cabin served as a comfortable guest house for visiting friends and relatives. But it wasn't the material success that filled Preston with pride as he watched his family. It was the life they had built together, the partnership he and Josephine had forged, stronger for having been broken and remade. The family they had created, each child a living testament to their love. "Papa, look," James called, successfully throwing his rope around the practice calf's neck. "I did it." "Well done, son," Preston called back, grinning at the boy's obvious pride. Josephine caught his eye across the yard, her smile as bright and beautiful as it had been on their wedding day. 10 years had added a few fine lines around her eyes, a touch of silver at her temples, but to Preston, she was more beautiful than ever, her beauty deepened by the life they had lived together, the challenges they had faced and overcome. As if reading his thoughts, Josephine handed the rope back to James for another practice throw and made her way to the porch, her movements still graceful despite having spent the morning working with the horses. "You're looking awfully thoughtful for such a beautiful day," she said, joining him on the porch steps. Preston slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close to his side. "Just counting my blessings." Josephine laughed, the sound as dear to him now as it had been when they were young. "All of them, that could take a while." "I've got time," Preston replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A lifetime, in fact." They stood together, watching their children, James now patiently showing his little sister how to hold the rope, Thomas squatting to examine a fascinating beetle in the dust. The scene before them was everything Preston had once thought lost forever, everything he now cherished more deeply for having nearly lost it. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Josephine asked softly. "If you hadn't come back when you did, if I had married Philip?" Preston considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, at what we've built together, and I can't imagine any other path. This was always where we were meant to end up, Josie. It just took us a while to find our way." Josephine leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You're a wise man, Preston Wells." "I had a good teacher," he replied, tightening his arm around her waist. "A woman who taught me the true value of promises kept and second chances." As the afternoon sun bathed their land in golden light, Preston Wells looked at the woman beside him, his first love, his only love, his forever love, and knew with bone-deep certainty that some bonds were truly unbreakable. Time and distance might test them, circumstances might bend them to their limit, but true love, once found, could never truly be lost. Josephine had been his first and only sweetheart, and the years had only made her more completely, irrevocably his. Just as he was hers now and always, until the end of their days.